We have no idea what Johannes Gutenberg looked like, but this man did change the world forever. Now, the change in history is something that happened dramatically, but the history is not always told correctly. In many documentaries about this man, it is told as if he's a lone genius who came up with the idea of movable type, and no one else had ever heard of such an idea. But even in Europe, other Europeans were experimenting with this concept, thinking of how they could apply their methods in building a movable type. Now, there's something called the graveyard of inventions, and all of these ideas that could only make one or two movable types went into that graveyard. But it's not only in Europe that movable type was experimented with, and in some cases it continues till today. But before we go there, let's first explain how this one works. So, of course, you need ink, but the other parts of this type are actually very arbitrary. This design is overcomplicated considering what it is doing. Now, this overcomplication came as an advantage when it came to creating millions of copies. The part that is called the press, which gives it the name printing press, is the screw area. You can see that it circulates, and as it circulates, it closes down. This carving method, created by Hero of Alexander in Egypt, was utilized by the people in later years for beer presses and other pressing ideas. And in fact, it was also utilized in the golden age of Islam to create various mechanical devices. We know that in Ethiopia as well, it was utilized. Now, the genius here is that Gutenberg was not above borrowing good ideas. This is what makes you a great inventor. Gutenberg had no idea about Hero of Alexander, but because this method had already existed in Europe, he used it. Now, the reason why I say this is overkill is because you do not need this press in order to create the types of prints that would be typical in Europe. But you need it if you're going to do it fast and be able to create hundreds of thousands of books. Now, there's other components to this structure, but they're not that important. The three are the screw, the ink, and the printing itself. Now, printing was not new by this date, even to Europe, but printing itself in Europe came from elsewhere. It came from Asia, and ink and everything like that was developed in Asia, and then the methods were copied by printers. Before we go to Asia, let us look at these. So obviously you can see that these little pieces would jut out or stand out compared to the places that you don't want to print, and then you print it down, and then you've got yourself a print. This technology had existed for a while, and people could do it. The only problem is creating these things, which before they were never created of metal, they were created out of wood. Wood block printing is what it's called. And this concept came from Asia. But that's only one of the places that printing developed. So let's go quickly to Asia. China is one of the places that developed movable type almost 400 years before the Europeans ever thought of the idea. This concept would spread to even places like Korea and many more places. But believe it or not, China is not the first place in history to have movable type. Movable type goes back a long way. But before we get there, let's first talk about the one in China. This is paper money, which started during the Song Dynasty. In the Song Dynasty, the printing methods of China started. These printing methods, which were a great invention in the past, developed something that they didn't even think was going to happen. Now, this is a recreation or the original recreation of Song Dynasty paper money. It was not lost to the Chinese that this type of printing was similar to a die. A minting die is a type of thing that you strike, and it can put an impression on a piece of metal, creating a coin. It can also do it on other surfaces. And it was really the only way in the past to guarantee that you could create a coin that would not be repeated by several people, because it would be made in a specific way, even handwriting would matter, and then you would smash it on, and then that's it. And then that mold would continuously make that type of money, and that how much money you put into your area, that would be the final product. And of course, if you use a different metal, they can tell that you're trying to cheat the system. While the people who created this type of paper money using printing did it with the thought in mind that you could do things like this, they did not have that in mind when they were inventing it. In fact, most of the printing that was used in the past was to calculate families. And I will put a link in the description to a UNESCO person talking about this. So, people's families and stuff like that, they wanted to track their history almost like ancestral records, and also where people live right now. This is one of the methods that the people in China used to discover how many people lived in China. So local villages, local areas would have their own people who could tally up this information. You group it up together, and you know every single house in China. And it's repeatable. You can give it to anybody. Hundreds of people can get it because of this movable print. Now, if we remove movable print and we just talk about printing alone, this will take us 300 years earlier than movable print inside of China. And it brings us to the sutras. Now, different sutras exist in obviously different areas, but sutra basically means affirmations, or it also means and laws. And you see these sutras being portrayed in Japan, Korea, China. The movable type system that was utilized first in China made its way to Korea, but only way later did print or movable print make its way to Japan. This is the method of creating this print, which again comes back to modified seals that could create multiple forms of writing, but it will always stay exactly the same forever. So if you write a verse of the Bible, you can never change it because it is literally carved into the wood or whatever surface you're using. In some cases, stone was used in places like Africa, but we'll get back there. Now, I already mentioned that movable type is an invention that was not a runaway invention like that you see in ancient Egypt. So, ancient Egypt is a runaway civilization. The Sumerians are a runaway civilization. Now, you're probably wondering what a runaway civilization is. A runaway civilization is a civilization that far strips every other civilization in technology. This almost never happens. So, of course, if we take Egypt, for example, around Egypt, you will find other civilizations. So, because of reality, as a civilization, you can never really outstrip people that far. You can never really be thousands of years forward. But Egypt and Sumeria broke that rule very early. But that's only if you consider the faraway civilizations. Anything close by could have caught up to those places. I'm not saying they did, and I'm not saying it would have taken only a century. Clearly, it took a long time for people to even try to attempt to reach Egypt, and in most cases, they didn't. But let's go to one of these civilizations, Sumeria. So I talked about a ancient civilization that had created movable printing prior to other civilizations like China or Europe. And the one I was talking about was Sumeria. Now, of course, I could be very, very, very technical and say a stylus is basically a movable type, but I will not do that because we do not need to play that game because, of course, there are some people who wrote in coins or things like that and those type of symbols, and that's a movable way of communicating. But this is a form of punching into something, but this is not what I'm talking about. While the form used for printing in many other places was paper, in this civilization, the printing was done on clay. And the several different types of printing that show different letters in different areas tells us that this was movable type. It would literally was something that you could adjust and then do it differently. And obviously these were brick faces, but then you take these brick faces and you rearrange them and you have yourself a machine that can type in a way that is different than the stylus system that they invented. Again, this is still not the best example of ink to paper printing. There is still another continent that we need to explore. But I wanted to put this in because it tells us how old the concept of printing really is. And if you look at this cylindrical seal, this was you roll it on, as you can see, and you've got yourself a multiple print. Now imagine you can keep doing this forever because it's circular if you have a long enough thing platform. Paper came through to Africa, especially Egypt, through the Islamic trade networks from China. And as you can see here, there is a seal that is printed on, and basically this whole page is printed. It's almost a faded print. Now, this printing that exists here is actually older than the one in Europe. And of course, we all know the reason why movable type did not catch on in the Islamic world. If you don't, then you have to go look at some documentaries. Basically, it has to do with how the Quran is written down, and of course, calligraphy was huge in the Islamic world. So obviously, we all know what a talisman is, but for those who don't know, it's a sort of symbol that is utilized for what some people call magic that can be itself magical. So there's some magic in that symbol itself. And here we read from the Met Museum. Centuries before block printing was introduced in Europe, the technique was used in the Islamic world to produce miniature text consisting of prayers, incantations, and Quranic verses that were kept in amulet boxes. The text on this amulet is in an angular Kufic script. The six-pointed star, a familiar symbol in Islamic art, is usually called the Solomon seal. So you can see there, 11th century. Through trade with the Muslims, which is one of the reasons why the Europeans traded back and forth. But through trade with the Muslims, paper made its way into Europe, and through trade with the Muslims, this print technology made its way to Europe. Now, keep in mind, this is not movable type. This is carving a piece of wood and then printing. Now, here's the weird part. By the 11th century, the Chinese had already invented movable type. And so some Middle Eastern people must have known about it. But the person creating this did not. These seals were not limited to the Islamic world, and they spread as far as Ethiopia. But the ones of the Islamic world obviously spread far and wide. The copying of images, so printing from one seal or one wooden block to another, is something that happened all over the place. Now, remember, this technique is one that is taken from China specifically. And there's actually people who have found the wooden blocks themselves that would leave imprints. Now, most of these, of course, would be considered solid face, so they're not movable type in the way that the Europeans would use it. Now, when I say type, remember it's not clickety click like you do nowadays. Those movable types, you have to take it out, put it back, put it back, put it back, put it back. A mistake is a mistake, and then you fold it. Now, the Islamic world had many reasons for why they didn't go that far with printing, which did not become a huge problem for the Ethiopians. What you're looking here at is an Ethiopian printed book. This book came with Johannes Potkin. Johannes Potkin was an early printer. Actually, this book was printed in 1513, only a couple decades after the invention of the Gutenberg press. But again, printing had already existed in Ethiopia, just not this type at the time. And this is the thing that I was talking about earlier about how there's no such thing as a runaway technology except for the very ancient civilizations, saying that the very same seals that were respected in the Middle Eastern world were also respected in the African world and actually helped create some of their scripts, which most of it was handwritten, but then some of it was seal driven and then sometimes colored in. The stamps of Ethiopia are somewhat closer to batik than they are to how the Chinese did it. Now, if you don't know what batik is, that is another type of printing method that was invented by the Javanese. And actually, there's evidence that that printing method from Java had already existed in other parts of the world. Now, these semi movable seals found in Ethiopia that were used for printing. And the reason why we say semi is because even though you see them being placed in different areas, 90% of the time they're only used in religious books, and they then can be used for more than one thing, but not in the same way that writing would be used. But this is for another video altogether. So let me quickly get to batik before we come back to Africa. So the one they're talking about over here is from the 18th and 19th century, but printing by this time had already been introduced, and this one is only being done in the talismanic way, in the ancient way, because they're just going with tradition. As we read, in Ethiopia, customized protective scrolls that interweave sacred imagery with textual prayers have been prescribed by traditional healers for over 2,000 years. These were carried on the person of the individual to whom they were specifically dedicated to shield them from harm. Often, the customized content of the scroll is astrological determined. In Ethiopia, as in Greece, each human being each human being has a corresponding zodiac sign associated with a particular destiny and talismanic character. The iconography of the scrolls thus alternate between talismanic seals and representations of saints, angels, and archangels shown in the act of fighting demons. The seals are modeled on the seal of God that was revealed to King Solomon and feature geometric patterns intertwined with stylized representations of multiple visages and eyes that indicate prayer for the divine intervention. While letters are much more difficult to move around in history, meaning that they were invented later, the moving around of letters, moving images is actually a relatively simple thing, since all you have to do is create just a few images and signs, and then you can create them and print them as they did in ancient Vietnam, in ancient Java, and many other places. Now, in no way is that the full story of printing in the world before and after Gutenberg, but that is a rough outline of it. And of course, something to get into is where exactly did they get ink from? Did they copy other people's styles in later dates? So, in order to improve their things, did they borrow from other places? Why were they so eager to give other people prints? And also, why were they so eager to share their technology with other people? Now, I will add this last part because I think it's good enough for me to think that this being mentioned here is the same type of technology, but I don't want you to take it at my word because I will continue to expand on it in another video. So, this part is from a report of the Kingdom of Congo, and it says here the king gave the people in a month. They were brought to the court all the idols, sorcery books, and magic writings. So in Congo, of course, there shouldn't be any books and there shouldn't be any writing, except that there's something called palm paper. There's a version of this type of paper in Asia, and we do see this type of paper being utilized also in places where they already had other paper, like in Timbuktu. But I'll get back to that. So if we continue reading, it says there that the sorcery books and magic writings. Now, of course, long time ago, I had a belief about this magic writing, and I thought they were talking about actual writing. But after long checking, I feel they're talking about this symbolism because if you look down, you will get the answer. But let's continue read. So it says here, month were brought to the court all the idols, sorcery books, and magic writings which had been worshipped as gods, and truly great numbers of these things were collected. So, in other words, this is not someone saying something accidentally. He's saying there are books and magic writings, but they have symbols of idols and sorcery writings in them. And then he says they were collected for each person worshipped what most suited his tastes, apart from any sense of rule or reason, so that there were numerous demons of strange and frightening forms. Many held in great reverence winged dragons, which they nourished in their private houses, giving them the most costly viands to eat. Others, serpents of horrible shape, large goats, tigers, and various monstrous animals. And the more they were ugly and deformed, the more they held them in honor, regarding as sacred unclean birds, such as bats, serric owls, or screech owls, and the like. Now, here's the important part, and we should glue this together with the fact that he's talking about the idols in the sorcery books and magic writings. So he says, in sign, that F sound is a S, in sign, they chose for gods serpents, beasts, birds, plants, trees, various kinds of wood and stone, carving also on wood and stone representations of the above to form pictures. So let's go back. It says various kind. So in sign, they chose for gods serpent, beasts, birds, plants, trees, various kinds of wood and stone, carving also on wood and stone representations of the above to form pictures. So the carvings themselves are not the pictures. They carve the thing not to form carvings, but to form pictures. And this is in the context of him talking about the books. So let's go back up to the top and see all the idols, sorcery books, and magic writings which had been worshipped as gods, and truly great numbers of these things were collected. And then we put that together. So they carved them in order to form pictures. Okay, and then after that, he says, and not only did they worship living animals, but also those stuffed with straw. So you can see that when he says pictures, he's not talking about um, visual carvings. He's when he says pictures, he means pictures. But let's get back to that by looking at another area of the book. So I'm just adding this part because some people might think the word pictures there means an engraving or a sculpture, which it doesn't. And I'll read this just to let you know. So in Mombasa, where a fine city stands, whose houses, for the most part, are high and furnished with sculptures and pictures. Now I want to read that again. Mombasa, where a fine city stands, whose houses, for the most part, are high and furnished with sculptures. So he makes a difference between a sculpture and a picture. So let's read the last one again if we take in consideration that he separates picture with engraving and the other thing. So it reads here, months were brought to the court all the idols of sorcery books and magic writings which had been worshipped as gods. And then we go down to the bottom, unclean birds such as bats, screech owls, and the like. So those are the ones that are worshipped. In sign, they chose for gods serpents, beasts, birds, plants, trees of various kinds, and wood and stone carving also. Okay, and wood of stone carving also on wood and stone. So we've got the carving. They've carved on wood and stone representations of the above to form pictures. So the carving itself is not the picture. And I'll leave you with this. In the 1700s, there is a book about black magic. And some authors say this is definitely not inspired by Africa, but I'll leave it up to you to decide. In this book, you see black figurines, some dressed very much like African kings, especially the one with the dragon. Now, what is this representing? Well, what this is representing is these human beings as figurines able to turn into the beasts on the side. Now, some people just say this is European occult, and I want to mention that part because I'm not claiming that this is 100% representation. Now, can we compare the books from Africa with the books of the occult here? The answer is no, because they burned them. Unfortunately, a traitor, king traitor from the Kingdom of Congo, burned all the native books. I hope you found that really interesting. And of course, the main point I was trying to make is that most technologies aren't that far away from each other. These are brocades, by the way, not brocades, but these are Javanese batik style clothing that are made in the way of batik through that printing method. And my only point of this is that most civilizations by the 1500s were very close to one another in terms of technology. Any of the civilizations that existed at that time could have invented the printing press. And in fact, printing interchangeably, whatever it's called, was created in more than one place. And that is the lesson here. Thank you very much. In another video, I will talk about the clothing in Africa, the brocades, and why they were mentioned so often and sold so much in Europe as luxury goods.